So this week, Adam isn't here. Chris is also not here. But I couldn't have a better partner in the studio with me this week than James Landale, the diplomatic correspondent of the BBC and formerly friend and colleague of the Westminster parish. James, it has been a very sombre, serious and historic day for all the wrong reasons. When did you discover what was going on?
Like everybody, I got a text, my phone burped next to my bed, and you hear the news. And what struck me then and then throughout the day is just the sense of the enormity of the change that we're experiencing. I think in our trade, it's very easy to get sucked into the weeds and the minutiae of the job we're doing and tying everything together and doing what we do. And sometimes you just need to step back and you need to sort of pull the threads of history together and just say, crikey, this is a big moment because so much has changed. And we as human beings are very conservative with small c's. We like our ruts, we like our norms, we like what we know. And that what we know has changed today and will change forever. And I think that requires one to step back and take a breath. And it's very hard in the initial phases of a story, of a crisis like this, to do that. But I think it does require us all to step back and think, right, the world is different now.
And the world is different now from looking at the pictures of what we are seeing coming out of a European country, a country that's only about 1,000 miles away from where we're sitting talking in Westminster. We're recording at about 7 o'clock on Thursday night. Vladimir Putin's troops invaded Ukraine, a European country with borders with all sorts of EU countries, in the very early hours of this morning, about 5 a.m. And all of those certainties, many politicians would say, that they've had for their whole generation, all of those certainties that many of us would have had for our whole lives, that smaller countries, less powerful countries, do not get invaded by big, noisy, bruiser neighbours.
The thing that also struck me is, I mean, in my job, I tend to travel a bit, at least, pre-COVID, and I go to a lot of parts of the world where people live with conflict all the time, and we shouldn't forget that. The difference is that this is about Europe. It's closer to home, and there's that awful phrase, a first world problem. When people are worrying about things on the internet or something, something's wrong with
not being able to get the right coffee.
Yes, they can't buy something like that, and they're the first world problems. Well, those today, on a day like today, take a step back, and we get down to hard tacks. What we're talking about here is the city. I mean, I was in Kiev myself just a few weeks ago, and it is a European city. It is a place where it looks like, it feels like it is a European city, and yet, it is under attack as we speak.
War in Europe. Welcome to this week's Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
So the day began with Vladimir Putin's rambling announcement. We don't quite know when it was recorded, but essentially declaring war on Ukraine. And of course, from the UK side, like all the other Western allies, the response or the acknowledgement of need for a response and the horror was pretty immediate. There was a COBRA meeting, the government's emergency committee, at 7:30 this morning. Mid-morning, there was then a statement from the Prime Minister talking of the grave danger that basically war in our continent for the first time in so many decades. And then the Prime Minister was in the Commons later on this afternoon.
For this, Putin will stand condemned in the eyes of the world and of history. He will never be able to cleanse the blood of Ukraine from his hands. And although the UK and our allies tried every avenue for diplomacy until the final hour, I'm driven to conclude that Putin was always determined to attack his neighbour, no matter what we did. Now we see him for what he is, a blood-stained aggressor who believes in imperial conquest.
Coming to MPs and to the public with the UK's response, which won't be, we don't think it'll ever be, UK boots on the ground. It's really important to understand that. But instead a package of sanctions, so more freezes on assets, actions against banks, individual punishments for about 100 oligarchs and companies. James, what do you make of the UK's diplomatic approach to this?
Well, what's been interesting in the weeks coming up to it is two things. One is, as a sort of exercise of diplomacy, it hasn't been too bad. it's been relatively united. A lot of people thought, and the Russians presumed, that the West would crumble, that it would be divided and split on this, because there are differences over what sanctions precisely should be. But actually, in terms of strategy, the West has been remarkably united. And attempts to divide have not succeeded. And there are lots of fears, for example, that the Germans wouldn't stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But actually, they were first out of the chocks to ban that.
So big oil pipeline that would have earned billions for Russia, that's on hold for now. That's on hold, at huge cost to Germany and the rest of Europe, because it will mean higher gas prices and energy prices. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that this whole issue of sanctions and the big row we've had in the last 24 hours about was it enough? Look, it's quite obvious that no sanctions were going to deter President Putin. If you watched that speech earlier in the week, that 1 hour and 5 minutes long, it was all about why Ukraine should not exist. Historically, he blamed Lenin for it, and it should not exist geographically, because it was part of Russia and other places. And it should not exist politically, because he believed that the current government, although democratically elected, was illegitimate. And if you take that view, then nothing was going to stop this man. Tons to talk about, and we've got some great people to talk to as well. But I just wanted to compare expectations from the people we've been talking to today. So I've been talking to some politicians who've been party to some of the chats inside government about what's really going on. It seems to me that the broad expectation, and of course this is a very volatile situation, is that it's going to be very hard to stop President Putin getting to Kiev and taking the country and is trying to install some kind of propped up government. And that whatever the West does, they may be able over time to degrade his economy, to make it really unworthwhile for him to be there. But at this stage, it seems like the expectation is it will be very hard to do that, partly because Russian special forces seem to have been inside Ukraine already, looking for people who might help them, and also looking for people who they might have to take out or remove, who might be people who would resist. But does that match up with what you've heard from your end of the landscape? The people I talk to, whose names I can't repeat, and I can't say where they come from. It's Newscast, but you don't give away your sources. It's okay. It's still the deal. So the idea was that there would be a quick thrust to Kiev, but also a second effort to seal off and control Ukraine's forces in the east, because that's where the weight of Ukraine's elite troops are. What the Russians don't want is those two to unite. The question mark hanging over that, though, is when you talk to all the military specialists, is they say, look, what happens when the Russian forces get to Kiev? Do they just encircle it and hope that they can oust the sitting government and replace it with their own puppet regime? But if they cannot do that, do they then actually have to enter Kiev proper? Because entering Kiev proper, and if that is defended by Ukraine, suddenly you get into urban warfare. Urban warfare is slow, it is bloody, it is difficult, with huge casualties on both sides. And that is the sort of scenario that the military guys say Russia would probably want to avoid if it can. So it's easy to drive military tanks through the countryside. Well, down through roads and things. But if you get to an urban environment, then it becomes different. And so I think that's the interesting question, is if that's where we get to. And slowing down, therefore, may be one of the best things that the Western allies could hope for, just to slow things down and try to make things harder for Vladimir Putin. Just before we move on, I think one of the other things to say is this, this isn't remote. We're all going to feel this when we fill up our car, maybe even when we buy bread at the supermarket. Ukraine's a huge food exporter. This isn't something that's just happening far away. It's going to do all sorts of things. Possibly there could be price shocks, one minister in government said to me today. So we are all going to feel this. So whether or not you're the kind of person who follows foreign affairs and whether or not you're somebody really well acquainted with all of this and Vladimir Putin's mode of behaviour, we are all going to feel this in one way or another. Yeah, that's certainly, if this is something that is resisted by the West for a period of time, then there will be a price to be paid for it, economically and socially, certainly. And I think lots of people in this country, Ukraine, it's on the edge of Europe, you sort of know vaguely where it is. But James, as you're a diplomatic expert, just tell us a bit about the geography of what's going on. You've got to understand, Ukraine is an enormous country. You know how in the past, newspapers just say something is compared to the size of Wales. Well, Ukraine is sort of, France and Germany stuck together with a few other countries. It is enormous from east to west.
Obviously, the initial flashpoint was towards the east, the area known as the Donbass, where there was the disputed regions. Then to the south, obviously, Crimea, that was then annexed by Russia in 2014. And then just spread around the country. If you look at the map, Kiev right slap bang in the middle to the north, crucially close to Belarus, where thousands and thousands of Russian troops has been based. And then all around it, you can see those little flashpoints, just shows you the sheer scale and geographic breadth of the incursion, the invasion that is taking place.
And Kiev, of course, the fear in the UK government certainly is that Putin's troops are all heading for the capital. And right there for us now tonight, I'm pleased to say on Newscast again, is Lyse Doucet, our excellent and amazing BBC Chief International Correspondent. You're in Kiev, Lyse. What does it feel like there to you?
Laura and James, I have to confess that even though we have been poring over those intelligence reports, we're seeing more intelligence being brought out into the open than any other conflict of our time. The Americans are sharing more intelligence with their European partners than in any other conflict of their time. But every time I heard President Biden or Boris Johnson saying President Putin is going to target Kiev, I said, and in conversations with others, even defense ministers and foreign ministers, no, really? Would President Putin really try to take over Kiev? It seemed unthinkable. But I have to say that in Kiev tonight, Ukrainians are thinking the unthinkable. Russian forces have already taken over a major airfield, which is just an hour and a half drive from here, and further north, closer to the Belarusian border. They've now, again unthinkably, taken over the Chernobyl power station. Ukrainians went to bed last night. In fact, many didn't get any sleep. Tonight will be another sleepless night because they'll be thinking, is Kiev going to be hit? Is Kiev going to be the target?
What sort of strategy do you infer from what's happened today? What do you think is the Russian aim?
You see the comments on social media, half in jest, the black humour one often sees in times like this, although this is no laughing matter, that this time Western intelligence was correct. They talked about a movement into Ukraine from many directions. We have seen them coming from the north, where President Putin said, no, we're not going to invade. These are just military exercises with Belarus, with our allies in Belarus. On the east, where Russia said, no, we've had tens of thousands of troops on the border with eastern Ukraine for a long time. From the south, they're also coming in. The Russian Navy now in the Black Sea. They're coming in like this, and there was talk of this pincer movement to come and take Kiev. So from what we see is that they are steadily moving forward. Yes, Ukrainian forces are fighting back. But when you look at these shocking images coming from across Ukraine today, I could only think of President Zelensky time and again saying in recent weeks, thank you so much for the weapons and ammunition that Western armies have been sending us. Thank you so much for the training that Western armies have been giving us. But when it comes to the fight, it will be only Ukraine which will be doing this fight.
And Lyse, from people you've spoken to in Ukraine in the last 24 hours, what sticks in your mind? Who have you met? Who have you talked to? What decisions and thoughts are in people's minds?
These are historic times. These are times that matter, most of all to Ukrainians, but to all of us. These are times to turn to poets and philosophers. And I heard from a philosopher today who said, Ukrainians, we're just ordinary people. We just want to live normal lives. We want to live in our own country. But he says, I have 3 daughters. And quite possibly, we are thinking this could be the end of our normal times. This is a story of our time. We had the pandemic which crossed borders. We had the climate emergency which crossed borders. And this is the crossing borders of all crossing borders that we're seeing tonight and for the many days to come.
Lyse, thank you so much. And please, you and your team out there and everybody working so hard, go well, stay safe. Tons to get through, but who else better to try help us navigate it than somebody who has been not just a cabinet minister for a long time, but who was the foreign secretary once upon a time. Jeremy Hunt, Conservative MP and now Chair of the Health Select Committee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Laura.
Hello. So just first off, most straightforwardly, obviously, having been Foreign Secretary between you were 2018-19, so recently in the sweep of history, what did you make of what the Prime Minister announced today? What he described as this, really severe package of sanctions. What's your take?
Well, I think it's a lot better than what we had yesterday. But the truth is sanctions are not going to be enough. Putin will have predicted sanctions and discounted sanctions, and they're going to take a very long time to work because he's got $600 billion of foreign currency reserve. And what you're really trying to do with sanctions is to make it more difficult for the Russian state to finance the Russian military. So it's a long-term game, but it's definitely the right thing to do. But I'm afraid history has really changed today, and we've got to revisit all our assumptions, and we've got to go back to looking at whether we have the right defence capability in Europe. Because for the first time, really, that I can remember, certainly the first time this century, we have a major power that is prepared to smash and grab smaller countries on its periphery. And that is a massive, massive change.
What does that mean in practical terms? Does it mean just reconstituting the way we think about NATO, the way we think about our own armed forces, how much resource we spend on it?
Well, obviously, you have to look at the funding for defence, but there are also bigger questions we have to ask. I mean, what about those smaller countries that aren't members of NATO? We know we go to the defence of Poland, but there are lots of other smaller countries that may be at risk in the way Ukraine was. What happened if this happened in Asia at the same time as it was happening in Europe? Does it work that European countries spend about 2% of their defence, of their GDP on defence? America spends 4%, and we expect America to take a leadership role. So all these things are now sadly going to have to be rethought.
Jeremy, what do you think about the United Nations? Because one of the things that struck me today was just extraordinary image in the early hours of the United Nations Security Council meeting to an emergency session to discuss this crisis. And yet it was a meeting that was chaired by a Russian diplomat. So you had an entire meeting discussing the military action by one of its own. Do you not think that people are going to look at the United Nations and think, look, actually, you know what? Yeah. This has to be rethought and rebalanced now?
Well, I think they will. But the UN is a paradox. I mean, you will have understood this from all your many reports from the UN, James. But there is a great paradox in the UN because it really has no actual power because it totally depends on consensus. But nonetheless, everyone who's involved in it says it is much better to have a forum where people who don't agree with each other can sit down and talk than not to have that forum. So, it is valuable that we have a Security Council, even though we have this profound disagreement with both Russia and China about how the world should work. But we can't count on it. In the end, what you have to count on is strength. And if you believe in democracy and the rule of law, that is basically NATO plus a few other countries like Australia and increasingly Japan. And we've got to ask ourselves whether the structures that we have as people who say we believe in liberal democracy, the rule of law, big countries not invading small countries, is it up to scratch? And I don't think there are very many people who in their hearts today will say that it is.
Do you think that the West, the liberal democracies that you're talking about, actually have the will to do that? Because essentially you're saying that they need to spend more on defence, they need to be more willing to deploy defence to defend their ideals, their principles that have been so shattered by the events of the last 24 hours.
Well, this is the most fundamental question of all, James, because, I think if you are looking at the 20th century through the lens of democracy and freedom, you would say that by the end of that century, freedom won. But it took us 2 world wars, a Holocaust and a Cold War to get there. The question is, this century, Are we going to get to that point where freedom wins? I think it will win, by the way, because I think it is just the most powerful ideal you can have. But are we going to need all that pain to get there? Or are we going to learn the lessons of what happened before and take action before it gets to that point?
But are you suggesting, though, that we might actually, this could be the beginning of a period of prolonged conflicts? And the implication, really, Jeremy, if I'm reading you right, of what you're saying is that we may be back in a situation where Western forces actually have to fight, whether that's through the organisation of NATO or anything else.
Well, when I grew up in the 1980s, my dad was in the Navy all his life. We knew that we couldn't take freedom and democracy for granted because there was a big superpower not very far away that didn't believe in it. And so we had that very different assumption to the assumption that we've had since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. We're now back in a world where two big powers, Russia and China, don't share our assumptions about some of the basic things about how the world should be run. And so, yes, I'm afraid very sadly, what's happened today has crystallized that change in many people's mind. And the question is, are we going to get our act together quickly so that we can avoid all those tragedies that we had in the 20th century? Or are we going to end up being as complacent as people were in the run-up to both the First World War and the Second World War?
But does that mean we might also have to change our assumption, which is the assumption certainly in this country right now, and I think, James, in other Western countries too, that there won't be boots on the ground? You know, and I was talking to some of your colleagues today, Jeremy, and there was a real sense of regret of some of them saying, actually, the UK essentially, partly over that famous vote over Syria, partly, of course, over what happened in the summer in Afghanistan with that distressing, to many people, withdrawal from Kabul. Essentially, the UK and many Western countries have taken force off the table, and therefore that is a green light to people who want to take countries on, who want to see themselves as strong men and roll tanks into wherever they like.
Yes, I mean, we are paying the price for decades of foreign policy failure. There is this great irony in foreign policy that if you have strength and you're willing to use it, you, in the end, are more likely to avert war than to cause war. And it's because Putin has calculated that in the end, the West won't come to the aid of a non-NATO country, that he's taken this enormous gamble with Ukraine. So we absolutely have to rethink all those assumptions, those comfortable assumptions that we had before, that basically whatever else went wrong in the world, freedom and democracy weren't fundamentally going to be at risk, because I'm afraid what happened has shown that's not the case.
But when you say we must rethink, we must get our act together, you know, as we talk now at, 7 o'clock, not even 24 hours on Thursday since Putin rolled his troops further into Ukraine, what do you mean right now?
Okay, I'm not advocating Western military intervention in Ukraine. We have never had conflict between permanent nuclear-armed members of the United Nations Security Council, and that would be a very high-risk route. But we are going to have to be willing to build up our military capabilities and be willing to project force going forward. Because if we aren't, then our opponents will calculate that what they did today, they can do again. And so that is a very big change.
Jeremy, you spent a large part of your career when you were in the Foreign Office, dealing with Russians. You dealt closely with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, who's the veteran foreign minister, who's held the position for I think 18 years now. Do you think, though, that the Russian leadership at the moment is deterrable? It is biddable. It is persuadable that actually, regardless of Western strength, Western unity, because you could argue that there has been a greater sense of Western unity than some had imagined. That there's been greater agreement about sanctions. There's been an awful lot of diplomacy going on, and yet the Russians have carried on and done what they've done. Do you think that they're persuadable?
I do, and we could have averted what happened, but they fundamentally interpreted what happened, for example, after the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London, that horrific poisoning We huffed and we puffed. And then a few years later, both the government in Britain and in the United States said they wanted to do a reset of relations and give the Russians another chance.
Wasn't it one B. Johnson who went as Foreign Secretary to go and try and have that reset with Lavrov?
Well, I think it may have even been earlier than that as well, under his predecessors. And we had the same thing happened after the invasions in Georgia and after Crimea. And each time the Russians interpreted this as us wanting to make a bit of noise when they did something bad, but in the end, not being willing to follow through. And that's what has to be different this time.
OK, Jeremy, well, we must leave it there, but we appreciate you, as ever, coming on Newscast and giving us the benefit of your expertise and your views. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Indeed, for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Just listening to Jeremy Hunt, I was recalling not just his meeting with Lavrov, not just Boris Johnson's meeting with Lavrov, but also Lavrov's meeting with Liz Truss a couple of weeks ago. What's it like in your job dealing with Russian politicians, officials or advisors? Do they behave very differently?
On some levels, they're very similar. I mean, you know, special advisors in Westminster can get quite fierce at times. And they don't just want to give the journalist information. They want to try and convince you of their argument. And they kind of forget that, you know, we're not there to be convinced. We're there just to report the news. And you sometimes get that from Russian advisors and diplomats who want to persuade you of their worldview. And essentially, so when you have a dialogue with them, you have to also accept that, you know, you have a worldview, they have a worldview, and therefore there's no point arguing over those fundamentals because you're unlikely to persuade each other. Therefore, what you do is you look for those gaps where the Venn diagram crosses, where you have areas where you can actually have a useful exchange of information. But what's interesting, though, is it has changed. I was talking to a former diplomat last night, who said the thing you've got to understand about Putin is he has changed. In the early days, he was more amenable, he was more approachable, he engaged with Europe, he had more friends, people like Chirac, Berlusconi. These were people who would give him some space. This particular former British official said that, for example, Putin and Robin Cook, the former Labour Foreign Secretary, got on together pretty well. And, you know, he remembers watching Putin laughing at one of Robin Cook's jokes, which, you know, I don't know if you remember, Robin, but, you know, not all of them, you know, you didn't laugh at all the jokes, but Putin clearly, but that has now changed. He no longer sees any real engagement with Europe. He has no friends, allies that he sees there, and that it's just sort of changed slightly. And also there is this view within the sort of diplomatic world that his own group within the Kremlin, within Moscow, is slightly smaller than it was in the past, and that there is a sort of slight sense that there's a bit of a disconnect, perhaps, between the sort of advice he's getting at the top and, you know, popular mood.
James, it's been great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you.
Sharing your knowledge, and a perfect person to sit in for Adam on a day like today, such an important day, and really worth telling everyone you can keep up with everything that's happening in Ukraine on our brand new sister podcast, Ukrainecast, with Gabriel Gatehouse, Victoria Derbyshire and the BBC's teams on the ground. In the meantime, that is Newscast for the week. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But thank you very much for being with us. James, thank you again.
Thank you too.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.